the end result of what a state ruled by terrorism looks like because of what's happening in Lebanon. I mean, everyone seems to tiptoe around the situation in Lebanon. It's a state within a state. Hezbollah runs geographically and in large parts of Beirut, a significant part of the country into which the Lebanese army won't even venture.
Christopher Pyne, welcome.
It's but nice to be with you. Thanks for having me on Frank Talk.
No, very good to have you. Very good to have you after your magnificent book, which I must say I enjoyed reading immensely.
Good.
So I'm sure it's been a great success. You know, Christopher, one of my favourite books of all time, and yours will be up there in due course, is this one there, Making of Goth by Paul Kelly.
Oh, yes.
Book, his wonderful book about the Whitlam government. And I want to start by saying this to you, that he quotes Goth and Margaret Whitlam, where they say this. This is Goth speaking. I and my wife sometimes wonder, is it all worth it? But we always decide it is. 26 years in the federal parliament, a huge amount of time away from Carolyn, the kids, enormous sacrifices. Half your life was Whitlam right?
Yeah, totally right. And, it's why people fight like cats and dogs to get into federal parliament because they want to make a difference. They think that they can. I mean, there's a bit of a healthy ego in thinking that you can make a difference to the world that you live in just to get started. And then, the reason you fight in politics, whether it's internally or externally, is to get your hands on the levers of power, right? It's not just to be there. And some people outside politics think, they spend a lot of their time climbing the greasy pole, if you like. But you don't do that because it's fun to do. You do it because if you have power, you can actually make a difference and you can do things. And you have to be in government to do that as well. So it is worth it once you get to that position of being able to make a difference. And 26 years, I thought, I'd done a good job. I'd had a good run and it was time to do something else. But I had good time on the front bench, 16 years. And that meant that I did get to do some things that I hope have moved the dial a bit in this country.
I congratulate you on your great career, but also on the timing of your departure. I mean, we'll come to the solar system, which is one of your favourite anecdotes in a moment, but to know that after half of your life away from home in federal parliament, that it was time to do something else. It's not something that, without naming names, too many of your colleagues, there's a lot of your colleagues, past and present and no doubt future, that can't see the end, won't see the end. And there's that famous character in Shawshank Redemption, the prisoner that got out, that they become institutionalised and they know nothing else and they won't leave and they can't leave and they can't see a life beyond politics. It was obviously a momentous decision to leave, a great decision for your family. But, so few see life in politics as clearly as you have.
Well, I think it's a great sadness that a lot of politicians, when they leave, are quite bitter and resentful. And I've always been shocked because to get to serve in the House of Representatives, to get to be a cabinet minister, is a real privilege and an opportunity. And sure, it's there's a bit of glamour involved with travelling around the world as a defence minister or a foreign minister or a prime minister or a treasurer or whatever it might be. But it's a great privilege. And to be the Minister for Defence and to look after the soldiers, the men and women in uniform, is a big responsibility. So when you leave, you should actually look back and think, gosh, that was great, a great chance to serve. But some politicians don't. And mine was mainly because if you get forced out, you lose your pre-selection, you lose your seat, you get necked as the Prime Minister, whatever it might be. A lot of people get very bitter by that. And it's terrible. And when I was 51 a couple of years ago, and I was thinking about the change of leadership from Malcolm Turnbull to Scott Morrison, I realised that nobody there was saying, we want Christopher to run, not because they didn't think I could do the job, but because I was, to them, the wrong generation. I was from the Howard era, And I thought, well, that's quite a salutary moment for me,
Mm.
because young as Frydenberg and Scott Morrison and co, but I'd been there so much longer that I thought, well, maybe my time has come to an end. And that's pretty rare to have that moment of insight in any job. Really. Sometimes law firms, under the great oak, the acorn doesn't grow, as they say. And a lot of people hang around much longer than they should. And then when they leave, they're not as well remembered, right?
I congratulate you on your chilling clarity of thought and your place in the political world, because, again, without naming names, so many of your colleagues, past and present, have taken the view that how can they do without me? I remember famously I was with Jeff Kennett at Henry Bolte's once place for his birthday lunch in the late 80s, and Bolte had just spoken to Bjelke Petersen that morning, and Bolte had said, Bjelke Petersen, who's still Premier, said, I can't leave, Henry, what would they do without me? And, the clarity of your thought about leaving, because it is a momentous decision, having been on the front bench for 16 years,
16,
the jobs you'd had, to leave after half of your life is an incredible wrench. I mean, it was basically all you'd known all your adult life, apart from university. So anyway,
as you know, there's always somebody to fill the breach, and somebody throws a rock in a pond, the water just folds back over again. And once you leave, somebody else has to be the member for Sturt, somebody else becomes the Minister for Defence, and they very quickly forget you, but especially if you hang around a bit and keep trying to help and serve. But, there's always somebody who wants your job in politics. It's a very ruthless business.
There's one election we can't win, which is the battle against Father Time.
Exactly.
And he beats us all. I know when I retired as president down here, people saying, you can't leave. And it's like, well, but, I'm 62 or whatever it was. And there's always people to take your place. No one's irreplaceable.
You'd come back after having a stint in your 20s, I think.
Indeed. The only irreplaceable person is the great Kevin Rudd. But anyway, we'll come to him a bit later. All he thinks. Mate, can I just ask you, I'm just going to go through, I picked out some parts of your book. Obviously, in an hour, we can't cover your whole career. We can't cover the whole book. I'm just going to pick out some interesting points. Your father died when you were 20. He was 59. My father died at 81, and I thought I was robbed. So you must have felt at 59 that was a far too young for your father to pass away.
Yeah, look, it was still the most important defining moment of my life, I think, because it set the course for the next 25 years. Because while I was only 20 and I was a uni student, so I, was layering about like most university students do, I also had a moment, an epiphany really, where I thought, which happened that night that he died, upstairs in the hallway, I thought, that might happen to me. So I'm going to have to get on with it. My grandfather had died at 54, I should say, and Dad had died at 59. And I thought, gosh, if I don't get in a hurry, I'll be able to fit everything in that I wanted to do. So that's bad news for Ian Wilson, though, because he was the member of Third, and I don't tend to go quite so soon. But I thought, well, he's in my seat, so I'll get on with it. And he's going to have to go. So it was bad luck for him. But yes, it was a moment at 20 when I realised that I was in a hurry. And I don't think I've wasted time since.
No, you didn't. You talk about the success and an understanding politics of not being a dreamer. The importance of reality, of real politics, of knowing your place in the solar system. For those that haven't read the book, I'm sure everyone has, briefly describe your notion of the solar system so far as politics is concerned, because it's a beautiful piece of thought.
It's falling out over the Turnbull, Morrison, Dutton leadership week, and but we're very good friends, which a lot of people have always been surprised about. But he's a political professional, and I'm a political professional. I like to think I am. So we'd always got along well, and but that was a bad week. Anyway, within about a month, I thought it's time to have a meal and share a glass of red and put it all behind us, which I did. And I explained to him that what had gone wrong that week, in my view, was that Peter Dutton had come out of orbit. And he said, what does that mean? I said, well, politics is like the solar system. The sun is the middle and the leader, and then the major and minor planets orbit around it. And that my orbit was to be a senior cabinet minister and one of the leading moderates, and Matthias's orbit was to be a senior cabinet minister and a leading conservative. And if you're happy with your job, then you stay in your orbit. And that Peter Dutton's role was to be, and he came out of his orbit, and that means he started banging into all the other planets. And you can move from the outside of the solar system, where I was in the Howard government as Pluto. You can move close, but you've got to stay in your orbit. And Peter didn't, and that was the root of all the problem.
Does he still think he's moved out of his place in the solar system? Do you think?
Peter, look, I think Peter's very happy with where he is in Home Affairs. I think he's doing a great job, and he's a good mate, and he's pretty pragmatic, And of course, as you know, because you've been around politics your life, most of your life too, you can be a conservative or a moderate or whatever you like to be, but you've also got to be pragmatic because you've got to win elections. And I think Peter is perfectly happy in the role that he's got. And of course, Scott's doing a good job, so I can't see him going anywhere. We've changed the rules now, so you can't have a leader. The Parliament. So I think everyone's much more settled.
Yeah. No, he's been a great minister, Peter Dutton, and a great Queenslander and a great Liberal over many years. Can I go to your Howard Battler analogy of the great Bob and Nancy Stringbag, which is another very clarifying moment in how you think about politics, which is the ordinary Australian. And as you say somewhere, there aren't too many Bob and Nancy Stringbags in the Canberra Press Gallery. Just basically go through what you mean by that.
Well, I think probably Michael, I didn't exactly have a log cabin story where I pulled myself up from the bootstraps.
Except you had to get the lemon for your gin and tonic that time.
Lemon for a gin and tonic, that's right. Or dust the salt off my own peanuts or something.
Yeah.
Because my dad was a doctor, and his dad was a headmaster of a school, and so but I grew up with this ethos that for those given much is expected, that you're supposed to put back in. And but also if you've been a private school boy from the eastern suburbs of Adelaide, that's not necessarily the real world when it comes to understanding the struggles and challenges that everyday Australians have. So Amanda Vanstone said to me years ago, you've got to think about Bob and Nancy Stringbag. I said, what? And she said, Bob and Nancy Stringbag. These are not the ordinary Australians, because people don't like that term anymore, but they're the average Australians. They're the ones who basically want to be left alone by the government, get up with their lives. They're aspirational for themselves, their children and their grandchildren more. They love watching the sport, going to the sport, having a drink every now and then. They're not judging of other people, nor do they want to be judged. And when I was in the cabinet or waiting to do a radio interview or a television interview, I used to think I might use this word or that word to describe something. And then I'd think, no, Bob and Nancy, they would think I was a bit up myself if I use that word. So I'm going to have to use a different word. But it was kind of a lodestar. I'd always think Bob and Nancy will understand it if I put it this way. But if I put it that way, they'll think I don't know what he's talking about. So it was really just a way of reminding myself that most Australians haven't been as lucky as me, and that my job is to communicate. You're right. There's a clarity of thinking about all those, isn't there? And the reality of not being a dreamer. And Bob and Nancy, they're sort of my constant companions, despite the fact that they don't actually exist except in that description.
It gives you a great peace of mind, doesn't it, to know your place in the solar system, as you call it, because unrealistic expectations, kill a lot of politicians. They have ambition beyond ability, and it eats away at them.
So Matthias is now choosing to retire on his own terms. He'll be out on top. and everybody will say he's done a great job because he has, and he'll get a good next career, and he's young enough to have a good next career. And he's never tried to be any more than, you know, the leader of the Senate, a senior cabinet minister. I know people used to always say, oh, Matthias is going to come down to the lower house, to the House of Representatives and run for Curtin. And I said, that's ridiculous. You obviously don't know Matthias. He's very happy doing what he's doing. He doesn't want to do it. And happy with your lot, it's so much easier for everybody, because as I tried at the beginning of the book, the real problems, all the problems in the last 12 years of politics from 2007 to 2019 were created by vaulting ambition. That's Gillard snatched the prime ministership from Kevin, and then Malcolm and Tony, of course, we all know the story between those two that was passed back and forth. And of course, that week that Malcolm was deposed, it was all about ambition. And of course, you want to be ambitious to go as high as you can to get an opportunity to serve and make a difference. But that next step of upsetting the entire apple cart in one way is damaging in Australian politics, all politics. And it's funny, Michael, because as you're a student of history too, that 10 years after Menzies went was very tumultuous. Oh, Gorton, McMahon, and then Gough, and then Fraser in 10 years. And we forget that, of course, but it was there was a lot of, and after Howard went, of course, after 7.5 years of the great man, you know, there is a settling period. And I now think that Scott, because he's got the chance to do well and go on, I think he might well be another longer term Prime Minister. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, he's done a good job so far, hasn't he? Against all the odds. Can I come to some policy issues? You talk about education policy and the extraordinary difficulties in getting any kind of reform in education. The interest groups are always pushing back. And this is a debate we constantly seem to be having about teacher quality. My father's a teacher, so I've always had a very great interest in education. You talk about, you know, trying to sort of do something about the quality of teaching, and the debate being about teacher salaries and about quantum of funding. Gonski said, not get into the core of the issue. If you had your time over again as education, would you see now things that you might have been able to do that you couldn't do then, or is the type of reform you wanted to do just impossible in the current dynamics with the Senate the way it is and with the interest groups the way they are?
Look, it's a very good question, and education was easily the most frustrating portfolio that I've ever had, and mainly because not one level of government does it. The states and territories deliver the service. The Commonwealth's the major funder, along with parents, but the Commonwealth from a government point of view. And I used to find that the Ministerial Council was often a pitched battle with the states and territories basically wanting to stop whatever idea the Commonwealth was proposing. And this was just to give them more money without any accountability, which they all agreed on. And I think it's a great problem in the education system. And solving that problem is very hard unless you say that one government's going to do the whole lot, and including the funding, and make their own decisions, or whether the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth does the whole lot. But of course, schools are close to the community, close to people, and the Commonwealth's responsibilities usually are not. Their responsibilities are more the general major policy areas like immigration and borders and defence, of course, and everyone knows that. So it's a really almost insurmountable problem. But as long as the funder has no say over the outcome, then I don't think we're going to move forward in the education well enough. And I found really depressing in education was that the union basically had no interest at all in the students' outcomes. They would talk about salaries, class sizes, because they wanted smaller classes, which there's no proof that actually makes the slightest difference unless the class is very small, like sort of 10 or 12 students. Talk about how it should be harder to sack underperforming teachers. They said there was no such thing as an underperforming teacher.
No, of course not.
And eventually, after all these conversations, because I used to meet with them often because I didn't mind meeting with them, quite nice people. I'd say, let's talk about the outcomes of the students. And they'd look at me as if to say, why would you talk to us about that? We're from the union. There's all these problems, in the education system. And what I tried to do in the university sector was try and give more power to the local decision makers, to the vice chancellors, to the deans of schools, to bring market principles to the universities, so that they would actually put the courses on that they were really good at, and they could top for, rather than putting every course on. I mean, there's no reason why every university needs to have a law school, and yet they have them because they can make good revenue out of them. What a reason to do it, right? And they all charge exactly the same price, right? Yeah. So the city law school charges their students exactly the same as any other law school.
Yeah, it's a problem with the federation, though, isn't it? That the Commonwealth collects the funds, but they don't run the schools. They collect the funds.
Right.
They collect the funds. They don't spend the GST.
Do you remember when Malcolm was the Prime Minister and he suggested that the states start raising their own income taxes? And all these premiers and chief ministers who'd been kind of demanding tax reform, which is a euphemism to give us more money, all started saying they didn't want to have anything to do with the idea. If you were redesigning the federation, you'd say, look, the person who raises the money should spend it, and therefore we'll get out of education, and you can run the schools the way you want to run them, but we won't be giving you any money for schools anymore, but you can have these income tax powers and you can raise your own income taxes, and we might even reduce our income taxes with your increase. So first the funder, because unless they're linked, the goals of the two different organisations are different.
We seem to be in this incredible vortex where, because of the issues you've talked about, education reform, teacher quality, etc., outcomes for students, and you've written about, Latham's written about, many people have written about the falling educational outcomes in Australia compared to other countries. We just seem to into this quagmire from which we cannot escape.
Yeah, well, it was the nightmare of university reform was that every vice-chancellor bar one, so that's 43 vice-chancellors, but in living memory, were completely united supporting the government's reforms. But as usual, the students and other vested interests all said, we want free education. Now, you and I both, it's never going to happen because the higher education contribution scheme is fair. It means that students pay and Bob pays. And Bob don't mind paying, but they actually expect something for it. The idea of free education, it's not even a possible, it's a dream. And yet they have the rallies and burn me in effigies and all that kind of. I said there must be art students because if they were science students, they can't without some accelerant.
I love that. I love that analogy. That was a brilliant piece of work. You said, I know there must be humanities students. Science students would know they can't burn a plastic core flute without the appropriate accelerant. Which was wonderful. Can I just go then from the difficulties of education to defence, which is a wonderful spending portfolio which you took to talk about the integrated investment plan and the $200 billion that the government allocated to that. What was behind the thinking of that? Was this basically because Australia felt that it was behind the eight ball in terms of its GDP expenditure on defence compared to what was expected of us by our allies like the Americans?
Yeah, so Tony Abbott, I think, made the very sensible decision that we would get to 2% of GDP by 2021. It turned out we got there in 2020. We got there a year early. And that meant we had to spend about $200 billion over that 10-year period We believe that, quite rightly, the United States, as Donald Trump said once, he said, "I want allies, not protectorates." And I agree with him entirely. And we're only spending about 1.5%, 1.56%, I think, of GDP in the last year of the Labor government. And they cut spending in real terms by 17.8%, which even most of the Labor people were aghast at, because they used it as a bit of an ATM for a while. And that was very unfortunate. But it meant that our capability had been seriously run down. And we were very much reliant on the US. So $200 billion was a big announcement. And of course, the biggest spending in post-Second World War history. But also, Tony Abbott and then Malcolm Turnbull decided to use it as a hinge moment to invest in our own sovereign capability in manufacturing, remaking our strategic industrial base through the defence industry, which was critically important, of course, because the automotive industry had closed down. But they're similar because they've got a lot of science, technology, engineering, maths, and it's a very important capability for a first world country to have. So happily, also, Malcolm put me in charge of the defence industry portfolio in defence, and that meant that I had the chance to make the decisions and shape the next 3 years to get as much Australian content and, more importantly, new Australian defence industry companies and growth that are already there into a new industry, which is exactly what's happened. So companies like Electro-Optic Systems or Nair or Nova, just to name Morand, in different parts of the industry, they're all now smaller, medium-sized companies that are now actually very large companies. I mean, EOS has $1 billion market capitalization, for example. So we are really getting there now. And a lot of companies that had previously had civil manufacturing and a little bit of defence because they were passionate about Australian defence, they've now got a large defence company and civil as the second string to their bow. So it's really, really working. And it makes me very proud to think that will be a lasting legacy. Put in place the architecture, the integration plan, the naval shipbuilding plan, the defence export strategy, the defence industrial capability plan,
Defence Innovation Hub,
the Defence Innovation Hub, and the Defence Industry Policy Statement, so that everybody across defence, other governments, state and territories could see what they had to do to fit in. And then we made the decision so they could actually start spending the money in record time. And we're seeing that outcome. But that's a policy that's changing the country, and that's what you want governments to do: change the country better, not just the ring.
Well, you mentioned Trump, and he's right in the sense that he's called out the Germans and NATO for not pulling their weight in relation to defence, and it's one of the things he's done well. He doesn't basically want freeloaders on the American taxpayer.
Totally, and I couldn't agree with him more. We'll go back. And it's, I think Trump is absolutely right. You can't be in NATO and be a self-respecting ally of the US and then sit back and spend less than 1% of on defence. Canada spends less than 1%. And Canada is obviously a very strong ally and a Five Eyes country, and we respect them very much. But I'm quite surprised that a country with Canada's sophistication, size, economy would be so reliant on the US to provide an umbrella of protection. That's a classic example of a country that should be pulling on things like defence spending.
Yeah, agreed.
Now, in terms of the Pacific, is like India, Japan, Australia, Singapore, we need to be available to support the United States as real allies, not just rhetorical allies.
In the book, you talk about the Australian government's decision to, following Trump's decision of moving embassies to Jerusalem, the Australian response to that, which is a rather elegant solution to a very difficult problem. Talk about that, how that came about.
Well, during the Wentworth by-election, when Malcolm went and Dave Sharma ran and lost, and then subsequently won, Trump announced that he was going to move the US embassy to Jerusalem, which blew up, of course, here as well, as you expect, because it's an important issue. And a lot of the Australians of Jewish extraction were particularly interested. And that happened also, coincidentally, Wentworth is the seat with the most Australian Jews of any seat, and was right in the middle of a by-election. So we had an answer to what we were going to do. Look, it got quite nasty, of course, because a lot of the people in the media don't support the state of Israel in the same way as people like we do. So we mulled over it. I don't want to talk too much about things that might have National Security Committee, but we did mull over it a lot in the leadership group in Canberra, Julie and me and Scott and Eidenberg and the others. And I suggested, well, why don't we announce that we're going to move our embassy to Jerusalem, because it's clearly the capital of Israel. And we'll also open an embassy in East Jerusalem, when that is the capital of a Palestinian state, if that's how it turns out, if that's the capital of the Palestinian state, because we have a two-state solution, still believe, as a government policy, in the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. And that means two capitals, two embassies, and that means we can actually stick the obvious, which is Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but without offending anyone on the other side of the argument, because if they have a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, or East Jerusalem, then we'd establish an embassy there. And that seemed to be quite, as you say, an elegant solution. Took a little while, but it was an
Got there in the end.
It did.
One of the great things about the modern Liberal Party, again, we talk about this word clarity, but the overwhelming consensus and clarity in relation to Israel, the right of Israel, which is supporting Israel as a democracy, the unwavering commitment of successive Liberal governments. And it was very strong, of course, under Howard and Downer, not voting against Israel at the UN, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Cutting off funding to Hamas, et cetera. There's been a great clarity. And one of the disappointing things about our opponents is that we did have a consensus, particularly from the Hawke, who we know his history with Israel, through the New South Wales right at the party. And we now reach this fork in the road where they've now got this group, and Bob Carr has been a shocking disappointment to many people in the Labor Party. What do you think's brought about? And of course, Labor defined by the Conroys, the Shortens, Stephen Loosley, Michael Easton, Mary Alexander, Michael Danby. There's a whole history of people in the right of the Labor Party, emanating from New South Wales, very strong in New South Wales, supporting Israel. And they've now reached a turning point, which has alarmed many people within the ALP and the broader community. Why do you think this is happening?
It's a very good question, and it's a very unfortunate development. As you know, I've been to Israel 12 times, and I was chairman of the parliamentary group for 11 years, and have been a very strong supporter, and then put that into action as the minister with a defence cooperation agreement, or the memorandum of understanding that Malcolm signed with Bibi Netanyahu when he was there. So I've actually put it into action, which has been another privilege. And there's obviously been a strong support for Israel from Labor going back a long time, probably because the original leaders of Israel were all from the Labor side of politics, and Ben-Gurion was this, and the Hishtadut, which was the union movement, really was a big part of their government. So I think Labor in Australia felt that was quite a good model, and supported it. In fact, Dr. Everett was the first person to vote for Israel to be a state in the UN, you might remember. But I don't know why it's become such a point of contention within the Labor Party, except that possibly the two-state solution taken hold, that a lot of people have lost in Labor. And that cadre of New South Wales right or Victorian right Labor leaders has been sorely tested by the growth of the left in the Labor Party. I mean, that's why, if there's a national vote for leader, people like Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese are going to do very well, as opposed to a vote by the party room. And I think on the national the executive of the Labor Party, I think the left actually has equal numbers with the right. But that certainly wasn't the case when younger. So left has really grown very strong in Labor. And if they continue to happen, which I think is inevitable, it'll be like the Corbynisation of the Labor Party in Australia, and they'll be very hard to elect. And this issue around Israel is a really important straw in the wind. There have always been people on the left of the Labor Party who didn't support Israel. I mean, Tanya Plibersek said years ago that Ariel should walk them, which of course she's now withdrawn, which is a good thing. But they were a very small group, a sort of ginger group. But the group now is a very significant part of the Labor Party, and I think that's a real problem. But it's mainly because that group in the left have never really supported a state of Israel in the way that it's developed.
Yeah. Just talking about the Middle East.
Bob does it, because Bob Carr's not in the left, so it doesn't really explain Bob Carr. So, and I've never asked Bob Carr about it because he's kind of really passionate about it to the point where he can't actually see any other point of view. But I like that. There's not much.
No, something happened to Bob Carr along the way, and his views on China now are alarming everybody. Let's just talk about the Middle East a bit more in terms of a resolution of conflict. I mean, every new United States president comes into office with the plan or the dream of being the person that can solve this problem. And I've just lost you there, Christopher, for a minute. You've gone off screen. No, you'll come back.
There you go.
Come back. You're back. You're back.
While we're having a break, I might open this so I've got better light. Do you think I look a bit?
No, you look fine. No, it's perfect. It's perfect. It's perfect. As you're saying, every US president comes in with the dream of resolving the problem in the Middle East. And we know probably in my lifetime, the person that closest to it was Clinton in the early days of, that January, the final months of before he left office, where with Arafat and Barak, they sat down and even got to the point of dividing up streets in Jerusalem, as you remember. And Clinton couldn't resolve it. His view at the time was, and since was, that in the end he didn't think the Palestinians actually wanted peace. And that's why Arafat couldn't sign. Chris, we're just getting back to the issue of Israel and the insoluble problem that Clinton almost got to solve, but every US president has dreams and aspirations, and it's never fulfilled. And we hope against hope. We go to the dialogue every year. Same problems, intractable problems. Hamas are fighting with Fatah, they're fighting with Israel, they're fighting with everybody. Where do you, have you've been there many, many times, you're a defence minister, give us a glimmer of hope that sooner or later that the terrorist organisation that is Hamas and their enemies in the Palestinian movement, Fatah and the countries in the Middle East, will one day lay down their weapons and finally accept Israel's right to exist?
Well, Michael, we're seeing the end result of what a state ruled by terrorism looks like because of what's happening in Lebanon. I mean, everyone seems to tiptoe around the situation in Lebanon. It's a state within a state. Hezbollah runs geographically and in large parts of Beirut, a significant part of the country into which the Lebanese army won't even venture. They have their own social security system, health system, education system living within Lebanon. And Lebanon is a multi-faith society. So if the Palestinians or anybody else in the Middle East, for that matter, looks at Lebanon and sees what it's like to have Hezbollah living within the state in the way they are, that's the end result of not having peace, not having a viable, functioning society. The only hope that I've got for the Palestinians is for Israel to have a partner post this generation. Mahmoud Abbas has been head of the Palestinian Authority for now some time, but he comes from that Arafat generation. Arafat had never experienced anything other than war. He clearly, as Abbott famously said, never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And he was given many of them, as you point out, and some very generous offers by the Israelis for a viable Palestinian state secure behind its own borders, and they missed them. I think Mahmoud Abbas is unlikely to be able to be a partner for peace, and it will fall on a younger generation, a well-educated, often in the West, younger Palestinians. And that's just going to take time. He's going to have to move out of the way and allow that.
Perhaps he might have an election later.
Well, of course, they can't really have a proper election in the Gaza Strip because Hamas won't let them.
Correct. Chris, before we leave foreign policy and foreign, let's reflect for a moment on the election coming up in November. What do you think?
Well, I think until about February, and I think his handling of the coronavirus has been execrable, and it's going to make it very hard for him to win. The economy is the most important issue in the US, as it is in Australia, and until February, the economy in America was travelling along really well. And, you know, he's obviously got idiosyncrasies which are on display to everyone to see. But I think he also has been given a lot of credit in the US and around the world for his economic policies in the US, and really also in standing up for US interests around the world, whether it's against Russia or China. And sure, he's created a lot more tension in the world, but I think he's really just called out the truth. In foreign policy and in economic policy, he's been very successful. But the coronavirus pandemic has kind of smashed the US economy and made his idiosyncrasies look almost unacceptable. I mean, there's some statements he's made, like, you know, what we need to do is stop testing so much because the more we test, the more coronavirus. And I just thought it's very hard to take a person test around that seriously as a president or any kind of job. So I don't think Joe Biden is particularly fantastic. And it's a pity that they haven't got a younger, vibrant, new breed leader. But I think now, because of the economy and because of coronavirus, which doesn't look like it's abating in the US, I think Trump will probably lose. You wouldn't want
Yeah. Chris, one thing I just want to talk about, I want to come back to some of the personalities, finish on the personalities you dealt with in your political career. But before we do that, one of the mainstays of the Liberal Party over at Jeff has been our commitment to lower taxes, for government, to deregulation. We now see the greatest expenditure by a federal government in history, then, now, and ever. And a section of the left who say, well, thank God for big government. Thank goodness that government is big enough. Josh Frydenberg is able to afford to issue enough bonds, enough money to keep hundreds of thousands of people in employment. And so it begs the question, the debate post-coronavirus, question of where to for, you know, the whole debate around smaller government, the IPA, et cetera, this mantra that we've had for generations, the view of the left of thank goodness for big government. You got reflections on
Look, it's just a very, very unfortunate time. The government was about to announce a surplus budget or deliver a surplus, and the reason why people like Bob and Nancy voted for us was to do just that, because they understand thrift and that you can only spend what you've got. I don't think the government could have done much else and pump prime the economy, to use an old Keynesian expression, like Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s, of course. So basically, it has reached for the old rule book. I can understand why, but we have to get back to the previous policies as soon as we possibly can. Yes, big government at the moment is keeping people, able to feed themselves and their families. and hopefully in jobs. But I'm sure Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison completely get it. The sooner we stop doing that, the better. The sooner we can get back to what we were doing before. But we are now 10, 15, 20 years away from where we were going to be in 2020, which is a blow.
Well, of course, in due course, people will realise that, it's been great, but of course, governments can't issue bonds forever, and it's unsustainable in the long term. So, the sooner we get back to reality, the better. Can I just talk about some personalities that you've come across, because no one's better placed from where you sat at the head table and your period in the lead group, etc., to reflect on some of these people. Why was Tony Abbott? You praise Abbott's leadership of the opposition quite correctly. Abbott was an utterly magnificent opposition leader, and the job of the Liberal Party leader was to get into government, and he did everything he could, and was perhaps he's a friend of ours. Why was Tony such a magnificent opposition leader? Seemed to be nearly as good as Prime Minister.
A very outstanding opposition leader. I think when he became Prime Minister, the team changed dramatically, because nobody mentioned it at the time, because people didn't really either know or think it was worthwhile mentioning. But when he was opposition leader, his circle was very big. The leadership circle was large, and the people who felt included in the team was quite broad. So if you're in the shadow cabinet, you really felt very much part of the operation of getting into government and getting rid of the 43rd Parliament and the Rudd and Gillard experiment. And then when we got into government, I noticed the circle shrunk very quickly, almost overnight, because I was in it, because I was the leader of the House. So, and a senior cabinet minister, but I was also a friend of Tony Abbott's and Peter Credlin's, and I was in that inner circle. So I didn't feel in the least bit pushed out. But I noticed that a lot of people had been there before. They weren't there anymore. I guess that's the bluntest way I can put it. And they just weren't part of the team, and the team became very small. And I think that's where it started to go wrong. And for example, I don't think if Tony shared with his broader team that he was going to bring back knights and dames and then make Prince Philip a knight, people would have been aghast and would have said so. And he didn't, because he knew that they'd do that. So the team had become very small, and he was doing those sorts of things. And once the genie was out of the bottle on that sort of stuff, it was very hard to do anything about it, right?
Yeah. What about Malcolm? From someone that came in with such extraordinary hope, it just faded to dust. How do you reflect on, you remember those months in whatever it was, 15 into mid 15 when he became leader? Polls were stratospheric, extraordinary euphoria around him. Why did
like it was a new Camelot? There was a
Camelot. It was a new Camelot. How do you reflect?
Sorry?
How do you reflect on that period? In other words, what happened to Malcolm Turnbull, I suppose, is the question.
Well, in my solar system, there's no doubt that Malcolm was the sun, and he certainly felt that way. And all the planets orbited around Malcolm.
The Sun King.
The Sun King, because he's a very, very, very smart, very sophisticated, urbane. I've never seen anybody unpack a problem and then come up with a solution as well as Malcolm Turnbull. But I think his major fault as the Prime Minister was that he couldn't resolve the fissure between himself and Tony Abbott and Tony Abbott's supporters. And when you change the Prime Minister, which is pretty rare, although it's become very common in the last dozen years, but used to be almost impossible, it makes a very deep wound. And I don't think Malcolm, and I'm just as much at fault because I was part of the leadership team, I don't think we did enough to try and resolve that breach. And it wasn't ever resolved. And so for 3 years, in some respects, Malcolm was fighting on two fronts, and that's a losing proposition. And I'm not saying that Tony and his supporters undermined Malcolm, although by the end of the period, obviously there was out and out rebellions going on, but there certainly it wasn't a cohesive operation, because there was one group in the operation who were deeply aggrieved. And I used to say to Malcolm when he was leader the first time, and he was constantly at war with Wilson Tuckey, and I said to Malcolm, Wilson's not going to go anywhere. You can't just, wish him away. So much as you might want to, the thing about it is that Wilson's going to be there in the party room, basically telling Malcolm he's no good every sitting. So we have to find a way of bringing Wilson in. But Malcolm didn't want to do that. So I think that was probably what happened to Malcolm, is that we never managed to end that breach.
In terms of great Liberals that you've admired, we know the history with John Howard and your relationship with Peter Costello, and mine, and the difficulties that created over time. In a difficult period back then, but finally he put you on the front bench. I mean, not every day someone can win 4 elections.
No, he's a remarkable Prime Minister and leader. And look, he did me a favour, because when I got elected at 25 and thought I knew it all, he realised that I didn't know anything. So, I mean, he's this sort of 48-year-old former treasurer, leader, and so on. And he's faced with this 25-year-old, not quite pimply youth, but certainly a callow youth. And he thought, I'm sure he thought, well, I think I'll just have to leave him there to grow up in politics. And this was exactly what was happening. But I was growing up in politics, and I was learning from my mistakes and learning the lessons of politics and life. And then Brendan Nelson was the person who really gave me a great piece of advice. So Howard made me the Parliamentary Secretary for Social Security, which hadn't been the job that I'd been fighting for the previous 10 years. Brendan had been the previous Parliamentary Secretary for Social Security. So I went to see him and I said, what do you think about this? What am I supposed to do now? And he said, well, mate, you've basically got to do this job like it was the only job you've ever wanted. And you've got to prove to John Howard that when he gives you something, you just throw yourself into it totally. Because everybody knows you don't want to be the Parliamentary Secretary for Social Security for the rest of your life, but he's giving you a chance. And that's exactly what I did. So I crisscrossed the country and went and visited a whole bunch of people who I was responsible for, and learned a lot about Social Security and disabilities. And he did me a tremendous favour, and I learned humility, which is not necessarily always on display when I'm talking publicly.
I wouldn't say that.
Not always on display, but he taught me that I need to learn you got to crawl before you can run, and 10 years was a bit tortuous.
Well, Malcolm backbench for 10 years, as we know, before he got added, so you're in good company. Hey, mate, talk a bit about the period with Gillard, who attacked you, and then you got square with her. I mean, her criticism here was childish, but she also was fighting too, wasn't she, during the Prime Minister?
It was dreadful to watch. From an opposition's point of view, it was marvellous, because we could see how the Labor Party was doing half of our heavy lifting for us, because the Rudd supporters really never gave her a moment's peace. I think in the book I was described that they're like Mexican bandits who come down and shoot, and then ride back up into the hills. And that was exactly what it was like.
Bad hombres, President
back
would cook.
and it was like that. It was terrible. I mean, Julia Gillard, remarkably, because people don't really understand this, I think they're starting to see it now. Julia Gillard is personally and privately a very decent person, but she could never translate that to her public appearance, because she had brought down Rudd after one term, in the first term, and she just couldn't get that message across. But she was never given the chance to. Her own support, her own party didn't give her the chance. And I mean, people forget now, but Rudd challenged her a couple of times before he got back the prime ministership for a matter of weeks. It was like a pitched battle every day for her government. And Rudd's wasn't like that. I mean, Rudd's government was actually very stable until Tony became opposition leader and said that he wasn't going to support the CPRS. And Rudd, who'd said that the climate change was the greatest challenge of our generation or something like that, he then dumped it, if you remember.
Yeah.
At that point, all his credibility just disappeared. But really, until that time, his government had been quite well supported by its own people. And it pieces pretty quickly, because Kevin is not as nice in person as Julia. And I think his colleagues were waiting for the opportunity to bring him down.
Yeah,
but with Julia, the opposite was the case. But she could never get out with the way she got to the job, and which was a bit like Malcolm. And of course, she didn't win the election, so we had more seats than she did. And those crossbenchers who represented Conservative seats backed the Labor government, and so it really lacked legitimacy.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to run a government if it's. And I used to say it was illegitimate every time I had the chance. People would say, "Why don't you give Julia Gillard a go?" I said, "Because she's running an illegitimate government." That's why.
I remember when people ask me about Kevin Rudd, I say I can describe Kevin Rudd no better than the great Wayne Swan, who said on national television he was a man of no late values whatsoever. And I think that really sums up Kevin Rudd. But just
things about too.
Indeed. Politics is in some ways it's a rule. There's a lot of luck. There's a lot of luck in politics. When you think of some of the great people who've been Prime Minister, our great friend Andrew Peacock, for example, Peter Costello, Kim Beazley on the Labor side. There is a great deal of luck in politics that people don't quite understand. And you look at Scott Morrison, who from nowhere became Prime Minister and has done an outstanding job, and was never really in the frame until the day before. So it does play a great part in the political game, doesn't it?
No doubt. I mean, the moment I thought we had a chance of winning the last election in 2019 was when that journalist from Channel 10,
Jonathan Lee, Sky News.
Jonathan, that's right, now on Sky, asked Bill to explain the economic impact of his emissions reduction target. And Bill didn't have the faintest clue. And he sort of spun his tyres for a while and sort of dodged and weaved. But Jonathan Lee kept coming back, asking him over and over again, to the point where Bill really lost his temper. And not quite his temper, but he lost his train of thought and was quite rude. And I thought, well, if you can't tell the Australian public, Bob and Nancy, how much your signature policy is going to cost them, you could be in bad shape. And the stroke of luck was, of course, every journalist after that wanted to trip Bill up in a press conference. So they kept asking him questions about detail. And Scott picked up on that, because in the debate, the leaders' debate, Scott asked Bill about a particular small business superannuation change that Labor had as a policy. And Bill clearly didn't have any idea it was the Labor pays. And he kind of fudged it, but it was obvious. And I thought, wow, I know you could be in serious strife. So, yeah, that's luck, because we didn't make Bill not study his policies closely enough. And there's a lot of policies. I mean, I won in 2007 just by about 900 votes. the editor of the Advertiser rang me about a week before and said, oh, we've got this poll that shows you're going to lose. And I said, oh, right. And he said, but it's okay because we're not going to print it. Because we I said, not. He said, well, we don't want to stampede, you know. I said, don't be ridiculous. You've got to print it. You've got to print it. And you've got to put it on the front page. He said, oh, why? I said, because if people in Sturt think they're going to be living in a Labor seat, they won't vote Labor. They'll think, oh, goodness, no, we don't want to live in a Labor seat. We've lived in a Liberal seat our whole lives. But if it's going to happen, they might toss me out.
Oh.
And they did publish it on the front page, and I won by 900 votes. So,
well, remember, I think I was over there a couple of days beforehand.
we were door knocking.
We were door knocking.
Ross Trevor.
Yes, and did a couple of community forums. I think that's probably what turned it up.
We did a couple of community forums, but I think it was you door knocking the lady in Ross Trevor who was turned the tide for me.
I think that's probably right. Mate, life must be very different now, Carolyn and the kids, when your Saturdays and Sundays are finally your own.
It's great. I mean, I love politics, and I didn't do what a lot of politicians do when they leave and say, I'm leaving for family reasons. If you wanted to put your family in that position where they became an excuse, I thought, well, I wouldn't have gone to politics in the first place because I've been away for 26 years. I can hardly turn around and say that was the reason for leaving, and it wasn't. So, but it's great at 52 now, almost 53, to know that hopefully I've got a couple of decades to be a present father and husband, and we're having a great time. Life is good. We moved to a new place in the Adelaide Hills. Karen loves gardening. Business is going well. The book's going well. Life's good.
Mm. Well, I look forward to coming to visit you, stay with you when Victoria is out of our prison that we're in at the minute down here.
It's a disaster, and it's really going to hurt the whole economy.
Yeah.
No.
It is. Well, Chris, it's been great talking to you, and I congratulate you on the book, The Insider. I loved your first book, which was a lot about your father and
A letter to my children.
Life lessons for your children. You'll have a glittering career ahead of you, as your career behind you has also been glittering, and you are missed very much indeed. The Chris Pyne motto, really, I could sum it up, which is it is what it is in politics.
Thank you for watching Frank Talk on YouTube. Please leave us a comment and don't forget to hit the subscribe button.